Hi. In part one of Opium to Opioid, we tracked the history of opium through the ages from the Mesopotamians to Egyptians to Arabs to China. And then we talked about the involvement in the state politics, starting with the East India Company, which needed a cash crop to trade for the tea and to avoid paying in silver. So how they've forced the opium on China. And this had many actors, including not just uh, the British, but Iraqi Jews, primarily one family which we talked about named Sassoons, who migrated from modern day Iraq or Ottoman Empire to Bombay, which was under the control of East India Company, and along with collaborating with British and local merchants, established a strong foothold in newly acquired Hong Kong and Shanghai, and became uh, super rich. At the same time, to be fair to them, they did their share of charity and all around the world. Okay, so we'll continue with this saga. And this was eventually banned after the uh, Enlightenment and strong pressure from the Chinese to stop the spread of the poisons. But still, the underground unofficial trade perhaps continued. Okay, now moving on to the first epidemic, which occurred on the west coast of the United States, and that was spreading, and causing lots of misery and addiction-related problems in California. So California passed laws and cracked down by the Board of Pharmacy and prosecuted as many as 1,200 people, which is considering how small San Francisco was at that time after the gold rush. It was a substantial number. They seized lots of paraphernalia and substantial amount of morphine, opium, and cocaine was confiscated. And this is for those of you who want to know the American history. There's a nice YouTube video link on the website. And this was labeled as the dope. Beautifully covered pipes were burned in San Francisco. And so that was the American first attempt. As you can see, there were multiple attempts and drug wars that were carried out with really limited success. Okay, so the regulations were passed, and those were primarily applied to the Chinese community. And there was something called the Angel Treaty that was carried out. And obviously, when you can't interrupt the trade, the government's best policy is to tax it. So they imposed a substantial amount of tariff starting from 1870 onwards and to 1893, and the amount actually quadrupled. And the tariff that was allowed was substantial for the era, $6 per pound. And they allowed in 1909 a crude opium import. And finally, in 1907, the Federal Drug Administration was established, and with the first major legislation that came on the tails of it, of the international treaties that we mentioned earlier in 1914 with what was claimed to be known as Harrison Act. And at the same time, the President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, not FDR, appointed Opium Commissioner as early as 1898. So there were varieties of attempts that were carried out by the government, to regulate, if not outright ban the trade. Okay, and let's see if we can play this video.
Shanghai, China. Here, cultures intersect. It's a Chinese city with an American and British settlement. Streets reveal a global mix of carts and cars. It's an international crossroads, but Japan has it in its crosshairs. In 1937, they invade. Their own film shows parts of Shanghai crumbling in a heap. Japan seizes the Chinese portion, surrounding the Westerners. Then Japan storms another city. They overwhelm Chinese forces within days, then massacre up to 300,000 citizens. It becomes known as the Rape of Nanking. The Chinese try to carry on amid the rubble. The horrors linger like ghosts. On this pockmarked building, the invaders flaunt their flag like a brand. Japanese soldiers signal a new imperial presence. America wonders if Japan's ambition ends here or extends to one of its own territories nearby.
Okay, so that was a brief introduction, and this was well dramatized in a movie which probably wasn't that successful, but was depicted the story called Empire of the Sun. This is a story about a young, rich British uh, boy who is probably less than 10 or 12. He's separated from his family and tries to survive with the help of two relatively roguish Americans who and tries to make a way out of when everybody, all the Caucasians or white people were abandoning the Japanese occupation. So it's an interesting saga depicting war in the Hollywood style. Okay, and this is, there were tons of refugees by this time. The war in Europe was simmering and the handwriting was on the wall. So lots of refugees were already leaving in primarily towards the west in Britain and France, which was soon to be occupied. So that was only a temporary stop and a majority of them headed towards America, but American doors were not that widely opened. So some of the other enterprising people went east and ended up seeking refuge in Shanghai. And as many as 17,000 people moved in 1938. Little did they realize that the Japanese were going to invade, and they were caught on the wrong side of the war. So in this, they were assisted by a well-intentioned, Western-educated Chinese diplomat who issued visas to, but and so they were welcomed in China, and so and so at the same time, and there was a Japanese Navy captain who wanted the Jewish financial support, and but at the same time, the government's policy was totally different. Now, anti-Semitism was widely prevalent in all the Christian nations at that time, and the Jewish diaspora tried to buy some land in Brazil, but the Brazils did not give them any quarters, and they were unwilling to sell the land, so they were stuck nationland, and there were leading to protection of the refugees. A variety of nations attended it, but nobody was willing to accept them. So, and so that a substantial number, as I mentioned earlier, 17,000 ended up in China, and they were helped by the Jewish conglomerate businessman Victor Sassoon, who set up kitchens and provided jobs, and then but he was initially not that enthusiastic, but he was coaxed into doing it by the other family, which we'll talk to in a little while, named Kaduris, who were a lot more supportive and identified with the Jewish cause. Okay, so this was interesting history. And as I mentioned already, the Empire of the Sun. And this is just an image of Hangzhou, and in the 1930s, how it was Europeanized. And these are varieties of pictures of the immigrants they were outlining. And even in Japan, Victor Sassoon had to be very diplomatic. He could not displease the Japanese occupiers, and at the same time, his sympathies allied with the West. So these are some of his estates, and you can see they had established the sanctuary, literal sanctuary, at this time. And the ties with America, one of the famous refugees who needs to be mentioned was a gentleman named Michael Blumenthal, and he was young at that time, and he grew up in Shanghai ghetto, and during the Second World War, he was fluent to Chinese, and later on immigrated to the United States, went to University of Berkeley, and gradually um, rose to be a Treasury Secretary of the United States. And when finally, as the official U.S. Treasury Secretary, when he traveled to China, okay, and he went and considered his experiences living in China, and he actually went to his old house where he grew up, and he was and this was his experience in living in Shanghai, was considered to have been an important factor to the communist China to invite him, and as opposed to the actual official Secretary of State, etc. So this is an interesting story how the human experience tied into international politics of the current era. And finally, the Westerners had benefited from so-called special status that they had actually imposed upon the Chinese emperors, and that was continued during the Chiang Kai-shek government. And with the rising tide of communism and with the end of World War II, the Chinese communists took over, and they finally put an end to it, the special status that the foreigners had, and the communists took take over. And finally, they decided that so many times the Western businessmen were exploiting China, and that fits in. There was absolutely truth in that, and that fits with the communist philosophy. And the Sassoon family had to get out of China, and it was a very succinct or poignant observation that Sassoons, for one reason or another, decided to give up on British India and moved all their conglomerate empire to Shanghai, because Shanghai was a free-willing trade city and much more international than Bombay was at that time, because Bombay was strictly under British rule, and other foreigners did not have much chance of establishing a strong foothold. And and that's perhaps one of the reasons why he moved to China. But his observation that China gave up on the Sassoon Empire. So that was his statement, and that is obviously the picture does not need any introduction. That is Chairman Mao, and I don't do Chinese, but that's his decree of kicking out the foreigners. And China was literally closed from 1949 to 72, but that's another story. And so the Sassoons had to leave China and the East for huge financial loss. That is not surprising. And where they were more British than British, so they moved to the continued British colony of Bahamas that was not independent at that time. And then later on, as it happens with, he lived on Cable Beach in Nassau, and he married his American nurse, Evelyn Barnes, who remained in Nassau long after his death. And she continued to support various charities in the Bahamas. And she eventually passed away in 1961. And because that's the saga of the Jewish diaspora, starting from Baghdad to India to China to the West again, into the Americas. So it's an interesting story as to how the politics and finance were intertwined. And this is the famous Cathay Hotel in Sassoon House. Now it was private residence on the top, and worked on the premises. And this were varieties of companies were run out of that. Then they were able to invest hugely in Shanghai with the building boom, and more than the business alone, they had great fortune in Shanghai real estate, and the famous Cathay Hotel was the place to be, first modern hotel, literally in the East, and in the heyday was one of the most popular hotels. Okay, and who is who of Hollywood and politicians stayed there. And he was friendly with Chiang Kai-shek during Shanghai boom, and the famous publisher of Henry Luce was lived there as well. And so this is, and then the other hotel, there was the Metropole Hotel at the same time in Shanghai. So this were the famous heydays of Shanghai as business empire. And at the same time, they still had enough investment. One of the brothers, Jacob Sassoon, had lived in Bombay and had owned real estate, primarily cotton mills. And this was in Bombay at that time was a major center for cotton and mill. The Industrial Revolution had shifted out of Lancashire and Manchester, perhaps due to easy access to the raw material and cheap labor. And so this was started in the 1890s. They made, and obviously they were helped by the American Civil War and varieties of other mills which were owned by the Jewish businessmen and the local businessmen as well. So this employed as many as several thousand workers, would produce varieties of local clothing, because India itself was a huge market, and the other mills were all around, which made all sorts of clothing material. And so this was, a huge Jewish and Indian empire that thrived. And obviously now that has all been folded, and the real estate clamor has taken place with the different form of industrialization of Bombay or Mumbai, as it is called. Okay, and these are the Jacob Sassoon. Okay, you can see the dapper style of in the Edwardian style. They were employed a huge number of people at that time, and they were sold after his loss. He was persuaded to take over varieties of mills, and they had modernized substantial management and really made huge profits and modernized the mills. And Edward Sassoon United Mills. And even when I was growing up in India, they were a big force to be reckoned with. And this is not only that, as early as they had gotten, India had a thriving shipbuilding industry, primarily due to good availability of material, primarily wood, because as I mentioned, the HMS Minton that was in the British-American War, in War of 1812, was built in Bombay docks as early as 1812. And so the shipbuilding tradition continued because of the huge forest and good wood that was available. And so Sassoon docks came into operation in 1875. That's one of the oldest docks in Bombay or Mumbai. And with the arrival of steamships, also they had the whole supply chain streamlined with ships and raw material from central India, as well as production in mills. So obviously, and so this was the Jewish empire at that time. So okay, so Indian cotton had long legs and was exported to Africa and Europe. And these were, and obviously, as it happens in large families, sometimes the big brother, had falling apart Abdullah was involved in opiums, and along with a Scottish firm of Jardine and Company. And so they were controlling as much as 70% of the opium market, while Elias went into the onto the other side, out east, and established his fortune there. And again was involved in the opium mills, and they were able to outsmart the Jardins, who actually ended up quitting the business in 1872. And they and because of their savvy and quick communications, there were two types of opium that were manufactured, one in central India and another in the northeast. Okay, so and the Sassoons had good contact with on both sides of the Indian empire from Bombay and Calcutta. So they were able to do price manipulation and distribution. So that was their ace in the hand. So they were able to outsmart or outdo these Scottish merchants, Jardines, who had the early head start, and they could not match with because they did not have the okay. Now at the same time, they were not all nice guys as we might want to think, in spite of their charities, okay, because they very well knew that this was the opium was harmful and was causing a lot of misery and death, but they turned a blind eye on it, and they actually did their own share of lobbying, guess in the British government, and obviously falsely convinced that this was beneficial in moderation, and that tradition of businessmen lobbying and to line their own pockets has continued, and they were friendly with the future king Bertie, and finally the trade did end. After the world did see the light at the of and the horrors that were caused, and the trade ended in 1906, and international trade was banned, and so their profits were huge, up to 140 million pounds. That is equivalent to almost 2.7 billions in current money. And so the tradition of businessmen ignoring the dangers has continued, and we'll talk about when we talk about the OxyContin epidemic with the Sackler family. And obviously, the story is repeated many times in Philip Morris and the cigarettes lobbying. So obviously, the profits were priority for a capitalistic society. And this is the picture of, just to keep their conscience clear, they did establish various charities, and this is still in existence, probably in Sassoon Hospital that was in a hill city in east of Bombay called Pune, and so that was their contribution to the local charities, and the Sassoons are still fondly remembered and respected. That this was the statue that he had built for King George, because obviously there were big Anglophiles in Bombay. So this was it's considered the Kala Ghoda means in the local languages means black horse. Okay, so this was the statue of the king mounted in all his glories on the horse that was built in the prominent business areas. Now, at the same time, while they had money, the anti-Semitism was still very much in the norm in the who is who of Britain and the upper classes. So the Sassoons and Rothschilds, they were loved for their money, and they were, but and behind their back, they were considered hail to the king of Jews, and even the prince was looked down upon or booed when he went to the races. So the anti-Semitism from the Protestant Christians of Britain was still not so subtle, and at the same time, there were varieties of nasty limericks that were, Sassoons with gold-loving coon. So you can just see that this was the hatred of Jews and the anti-Semitism was around for 2,000 years and was still very much around. So, okay. And again, even their physical appearance was looked down upon. Okay, and and we already talked about not just the hospitals, but varieties of David Sassoon's name have been there in current Bombay and even in Shanghai. David Sassoon Library, hospitals, synagogues, reformatory, and deaf school. And when the British royalty, King George, visited India, they had, in view of his glory, obviously, they had built a big monument called Gateway of India, and then that was played by Indian merchants as well as by the Sassoon family. And part of it was, they also established a big tower clock in a style of the London Big Ben, and also established the museum for the local antiquities, and was appropriately named Victoria and Albert Museum in Bombay. Now it's obviously been renamed, and there were similar charities elsewhere, and so this was and varieties of hospitals again, in Bombay that are various outpatient services are still continued very much so at this time. Okay, and this was his private residence called San Susi, and now that has been converted into a hospital in modern day Mumbai. Okay, and you can see some of the relics of the Torah scrolls, and at the old one of the old synagogues in Bombay, and so these are the ties. In India, unlike the West, did not have anti-Semitism. Indians accepted all religions with open arms, except perhaps the Muslims, because they were the rulers, and the majority of Hindus were delegated to second-class citizens. But the Zoroastrians, the Armenians, the Christians, and the Jews were reasonably well accepted. And this is the Sir Jacob Sassoon High School. That's still very much there. So, and the various synagogues in Bombay, as you can see there, it's still very much functioning. And this has been renovated recently, and so it's not blue anymore. Okay, so this is a nice historical tour, and this is again a synagogue in Pune, India. Okay, so these are some of the interesting, and at the same time, the Baghdadi Jews not only had presence on the west coast of India, that is Bombay or Mumbai, but they also had substantial presence on the other side, because that was the first the empire of the British India, Calcutta, until they later on, it was in 1910, was moved to Delhi. And so this was the Baghdadi Jews were in Calcutta, and you can see how they were at the amalgam of culture, the Middle Eastern traditions, as well as the Arabic and European traditions were intermixed. And this was a variety, and there were as many as 8 synagogues in Calcutta at that time in the early part of 20th century. Okay. Now, the lesser Sassoons were well known primarily due to the poet Sassoon, Victor Sassoon, who was the playboy of the Western world for a while. And this was a lesser known family. This was, I read a book called The Men Who Created Shanghai that gave me a lot of impetus to research this subject. And the other family was Kaduris, and who remained in the East, and they made their peace with the communist China, and they continued very much a strong presence under the Chinese umbrella and into modern day Hong Kong. This family is less well known, and in the West it's called Kaduri family. And this was again, they were almost contemporary of Sassoon's, and he worked as actually under the Sassoon at his age as young as 15. In those days, there wasn't much of a childhood, and he was apprenticed under the Sassoon umbrella as an apprentice in Hong Kong, and primarily, and at the same time, he was obviously more open-minded than his employers. He shared some disinfectant with the local Chinese because they were suffering too from contagion at that time. He was reprimanded for that, and he borrowed some money from his brother, and then obviously married as into money, and decided to go on business for himself. And at the same time, so and marrying a rich British Jewish woman, okay, at that time gave him a door to the uh, upper class in Britain. And at the same time, she was a force to be reckoned with. You can just see that she traveled all the way, did not choose to live in London, but traveled to across China and did her share of making some improvement in the local Chinese condition. Okay, and 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 they had turned down obtaining British citizenship, and that did not go well. They were blocked out of Hong Kong business by Brits, but their children decided which side of the bread was buttered and decided to become more British. And their wife, one of the wives, was progressive as well, a young lady named Laura, and she was active in suffragette movement that was in full swing in the early 20th century. So, and then later on, he moved his whole uh, business empire to Hong Kong and was involved in Hong Kong, providing electricity for the city of Hong Kong and tram supplies. So they had branched out into varieties of business. Okay, and at the same time, they were, obviously markedly rich. And finally, Mr. Kaduri received citizenship and knighthood, after several years of a trial and in 1926. And so again, they were in the good offices of the British establishment. The Kaduri school, did not forget where they had come from. They had established a school in Mesopotamia. But by this time, the Ottoman Empire was on its downswing, and then so they had done their share of charity in Middle East as well. Okay, and even but at the same time, they continued just like Sassoons. They continued to suffer subtle discrimination in the British society. Okay, and after the First World War, they just decided they had enough of trying to establish. They returned to Shanghai and continued to make their money there. And this was, they had a huge Hong Kong real estate empire, and you can see that. And they were the pioneers of HSBC, and the abbreviation may not be familiar to all of you, but it stands for Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. Okay, and so that is still very much there. Thank you. And this is the Kaduri real estate, and you can see that they controlled, St. George's, varieties of buildings in Hong Kong, the at very prime Peninsula Hotel, which is one of the famous place or address, in Hong Kong, and there are the varieties of family homes. So this is, obviously they were the big real estate magnates in Hong Kong. So they became not just brokers, and to become financiers of the Chinese Revolution during Sun Yat-sen and later on with Communist China. And so there were, huge number of, foreigners at that time, and so this was not just American and British, but also French. And at the same time, there were huge number of Chinese who were the second-class citizen in their own country, and they had more or less a free press at that time, and there were some encounters with Mao and Zhou Enlai at that time, and so you can just see the marble hall of the Kaduri residence in modern day Shanghai, okay, and which was really a luxurious estate, as you can see that this was envy of visitors, and with the grandeur, it covered huge areas, and really impressed. They used their wealth, without any reservations, obviously. And so, and they also owned varieties of hotels in that time. So this is the Shanghai skyline, that majestic ballrooms were connected, and even the the leader of China, modern China, Chiang Kai-shek, wedding was over there, and this was the Majestic Hotel. This were very luxurious, and then at the same time, so they're competing with the Cathay Hotel, and who is who of Western world managed to stay there. And they also were into supplying energy with the gas and electric companies. And so these are the two, kings, the Kaduri families, and at the same time they were assisted by the Grand Old Man of Hong Kong, who was a very enterprising Chinese businessman, Mr. Ho Tung, who was a Eurasian. His father was European of Dutch Jewish ancestry, and then he even outshone the Kaduris for that matter. He became one of the large real estate owners as well. Okay, now unlike the Sassoons, the Kaduris were a lot more Zionist supporters. Okay, and they were the first to assist the refugees who were pouring in from the Nazi Europe. And these are other brothers who were, during Second World War, they were held as a prisoner because they decided not to leave, but they stayed back and paid the price for it later on. And so after serving time under the Japanese occupation, they moved to Hong Kong and decided to stay there instead of moving away, okay, and help rebuild with cooperation with the local Chinese government. And so this was, and by this time, Shanghai was with, a lot of the big money was leaving Shanghai, and this was, so the rise of Hong Kong was on the back of collapse of Shanghai, and they had by this time they had learned, they seen the writing on the wall. They had diversified their business to Australia, and Horace Kaduri, who was in prison, was later on released, and at the same time, they continued to support the British establishment. So you can say that the Kaduris were the last Victorian, and they were not too keen for Hong Kong independence. They loved living under the British umbrella. Okay, and so this was the story of mixed loyalties. And we already talked about this particular movie, The Refugees in Shanghai, and this was the Western educated Chinese diplomat issuing visas. We already mentioned all that. Okay, and Horace Kaduri stayed on to help the refugees, and even though so they tried to work with Japanese, at the same time, and they were helped by some of the social workers and who had obviously left-leaning sympathies, and so they tried to make the best out of a difficult situation. And at the same time, they did not get any big help from US and London-based Jewish organizations, so, and they had invited Charlie Chaplin to help raise money, okay, and the Japanese knew who could be useful to them, and that they wanted to have the Japanese to stick around as a hostage, more or less. And after that, but unfortunately, with the pressure of the Nazis, the Japanese were forced to become more anti-Semitic, and so they, eventually, so they had to follow what their more anti-Semitic Jewish Nazi partners were forcing them to do. Okay. And so the Kaduris were caught between the politics of the Second World War and the anti-Semitism. Okay, and again, so this was, they had the largest generator in Asia, and they paid, the price, as I mentioned earlier. They were imprisoned for, a couple of years, and one of the brothers actually died in the Japanese camp. Okay, and this is the famous Peninsula Hotel in Hong Kong. Okay, this was again, this was looted by the Japanese before the 1945 war. Okay, and Hong Kong obviously suffered quite a bit during the Japanese occupation. The population dwindled, and but they after the defeat of the Japanese, the Kaduris took around and worked with the Chinese businessmen. And this is the modern day Peninsula Hotel with their famous green Rolls Royces, Okay, and this is, so they were, there to ferry their uh, prize guests. They may have as many as 14 green Rolls-Royce Phantom, and this even factored in the one of the James Bond movies. I think the one that is was featured it was The Man with the Golden Gun. So they have the empires. The Peninsula Hotel has branches not just in Hong Kong and Shanghai, but also in communist uh, capital, which is the communist Beijing, Tokyo, Chicago, Beverly Hills, Paris, Bangkok, and Manila. So they have a long presence all over the world. And this was another hotel in Hong Kong called the Repulse Bay Hotel, and was owned by the Hong Kong and Shanghai Hotel Group by the Kaduri families, and varieties of people who found refuge there at the hotel, including Bernard Shaw, Noel Coward, Marlon Brando, Prince Carlos of Spain, and they've all have visited and stayed there at one time or another. And this is, we talked about the Chinese electric power, and they have branched out now in India and Australia. So they're a force to be reckoned with. Okay, and at the same time, they helped the farmers of Hong Kong, because Hong Kong obviously was an industrial city, but had very little in terms of food supply. So he gave loans to local farmers, and continued, they supported, they gave loans to the farmers, help raise pigs, and for the staple food diet of, and they also supported the Gurkhas, who were the main hired soldiers of the British colony at that time, and there's still a very much presence around in the British Army. But that's another story. And here he is with the opening of China with the famous Deng Xiaoping. Okay, the four modernizations. So, and they were, obviously, they've worked hand in. So Kaduris were back on top with electricity, hotels, real estate, finance, and they were also instrumental in opening the Hong Kong tunnel between Hong Kong and Kowloon. Okay, so they controlled as much as 10% of Hong Kong economy. So that is nothing to sneer at. And he lived to be ripe old age of 94, and they're buried in Hong Kong. So they're one of the richest families in modern day Asia. So that's a big saga of how they managed to stick out during the wars, and during the two wars, to be exact, and the change of regimes from the Japanese occupation to the communist takeover. Okay, and this is the famous picture of the nuclear plant, which was again, no, surprisingly, there were local protests, not surprising, but that is owned by the Hong Kong listed group. Okay, and they're supplying as much as 75% of power need of Hong Kong. Okay, and this is, obviously assisted by Western technology. And Michael Kaduri was a friend of China, and again, he the China now has decided that these people are good financiers, and they're allowed to make their money under the supervision as long as they are not anti-Chinese. And this was, the saga of the mentioned the Jardine family, but this is some more information that this was the old Scottish farmers who were established as early as 1832 and were involved in smuggling, opium trade, tea, silk, cotton as usual, and then they moved on to Canton earlier, which is now called Guangzhou, and later on to Hong Kong, and were involved in varieties of other businesses with the rise of industrialization. And now they have moved on to Bermuda in this big multinational corporation that is still very much there. And this is their logo up there, as you can see. And this is, and these are the American servicemen at the Magen David Synagogue in Calcutta when they were flying over China, and from British India, and helping the Chinese Chiang Kai-shek's army to fight the Japanese. And so these were the Jewish scrolls that are still well looked after, okay, as we mentioned. So this is, the okay. So I think we have talked for a little while, and but we'll continue a little bit more to classification of. Now we'll switch on to opioids. Okay, now we already talked about opium and morphine. So this is some of the chemistry that we need to know about. This is the non-synthetic version is called morphine and opium. And then there is synthetic uh, opiums, which is heroin, which we talked about how it was marketed as being non-addictive, you know, and later on the chemists, had their field day with marketing varieties of derivatives which were falsely considered to be non-addictive and were marketed to the medical industry and to pain sufferers. And this over, and now later on they've been replaced with synthetic opioids, which are and the most potent one was fentanyl, which is used for anesthesia in very small doses, but has become a street drug and is now the biggest cause of death, opioid-related deaths, and the varieties of and there are various antagonist drugs for withdrawal that are devised, which is the methadone, which is considered mainstay of harm reduction, and at the same time, the opioids toxicity is nothing to be sneezed at. So there are varieties of antagonist, which the biggest one that is available is called naloxone or naltrexone, which is, and at least in majority of the time, it was administered intravenously and has prevented sudden death. Okay, and so this was a big story that we'll talk about over the next sessions. Okay, and this again, the varieties of more complex chemistry that is involved. Okay, so let's see if I can zoom in on that. Okay, and these are varieties of derivatives. We talked about heroin cut with fentanyl and various other potentially fatal drugs, and the other ones are from morphine. It rise to OxyContin, Dilaudid, Percocet, which was marketed as a pill, which was considered non-addictive, but turned out not to be the case. And codeine is a relatively milder variation, okay, which is marketed in hydrocodone and varieties of unless you're a physician, I don't think one needs to dwell too much about it. But they've all been used and abused from one time or another. And OxyContin was the big king, which we'll talk at length when we talked about the Sackler family saga, which still we haven't seen the end of it yet. Okay, and what is addiction primarily, basically? So addiction can be defined as primarily three C's: loss of control, then craving, and continuing the adverse behavior, even though you realize you're harming yourself. So only recently this appeared in the American Psychiatric Association diagnostic criteria. And that is, your brain does a number on it because there are naturally occurring substances. So there is a continuous need to use more and more to get, and so you become very quickly dependent. Along with that, there is a huge physical withdrawal that takes place. And so again, so that leads to varieties of bad deeds just to get your fix because there's a physical craving. And at the same time, there are, okay, this is has been fatal. And on the other hand, alcohol is a slow killer type of thing. So that has been accepted. So different societies have different way of what is accepted, considered as a norm as to non-norm type of thing. So even the smallest amount of drug use is looked down upon and is highly regulated by society. But at the same time, alcohol has been accepted from times immemorial. Okay, and at the same time, the medical community had a lot of false beliefs when it came to using narcotics, and either knowingly or unknowingly, they had a huge role to play in contributing to the addiction problems that we saw from 1990s to almost 2010. Okay, and obviously, we'll talk a little bit about the chemistry of morphine. Okay, or perhaps I should No. Okay, I think we still have time, so I think we have only recorded for 50 minutes. So we'll talk a little bit about morphine. The morphine history was isolated from raw opium in 1808 by the German. The Germans were ahead in pharmacology and chemistry, far more than Britain in the early 20th, 19th and 20th century. And so a guy named Frederick Wilhelm Adam Sertner, okay, he was instrumental in synthesizing morphine, which is a suppressor of pain and a very useful addition to medical armamentarium. Okay, so this was, the start of the improving the potency of opium. So this eliminated, so the need to cultivate a plant with high content. So they were able to uh, and so he was in, as he went in the scientific practice of those days, he tried it on himself, basically, and with combining with other chemicals, and he had a toothache, so that went away. So, and again, he had already, was warned about the addictive potentials. Okay, and at the same time, this was then later on, some other chemist boiled morphine with acetic acid, which was, the basic chemical at that time. And so that was again changed to something called the diacetyl morphine. So varieties of chemical additions were there. And very quickly on the tails of his discovery, the Merck Pharmaceuticals that were marketing variety of patent medicine, they started manufacturing as early as 1827, and that was widely used during the Civil War and the wars in Europe that were going on, and became the big armament help in. And on the tails of that, an Irish physician named Francis Ryant had discovered a hollow metal needle, and so that made it easier to administer it intravenously, again increasing the potency instead of intramuscular injections. Okay, and then it took several years for the big manufacturing facilities started in the United States for hypodermic needles and syringes and thermometers. Okay, and then later on, varieties of development took place of attaching a needle and to the syringe, and so that the made modern way of administering drugs, became a very widespread use, and so this was, and so you can see the use started in the uh, 19th century and again proliferated in the 20th century and became the biggest thing that was in the medical drug bag. And this was, remember, this was way before penicillin or any other treatment for heart failure or became available, or pain became available. Okay, and this was in this was controversies as to what, this was as early as 1823. This was, morphine and wine was given as a poison. So people were discovering the use and abuse were going on simultaneously at the same, with the discovery. So this was incidents of murder that was taking place, as early as 1823. Okay, and the name morphine comes from the Greek goddess of dreams, Morpheus, and he was the son of Hypnos. Hypnos is obviously the god of sleep, and that's where the word hypnosis comes around. And also interesting, the mythology very much like as if they had premonition for the potential. So Hypnos was also the brother of Thanatos, the god of death. So this is not only sleep and dreams, but at the same time cause death. So you can just see this is the artist's depiction of Morpheus in images. And it's a naturally occurring alkaloid, which is, the dried extract obtained from the capsule of poppy seed. And we saw that earlier when we saw the Afghanistan video as to how the sap of the poppy seed is dried out extract from the poppy plant, and it it takes a lot of labor to produce 1 kilogram of morphine. You can just see its ratio is 1 to 10, and these are some of the artistic pictures of the poppy flower. It's rather pretty in the poppy capsule that we saw earlier. Okay, then this were earlier, were powders basically, and later on the synthetic drugs came about, which we're talking about the epidemics. But before that, though, the upper class and had epidemic that took place during the early 20th century between not just men but also women. And so this was, the start of the evil that took place at the same time. Okay. And get into the chemistry. I think I'm going to stop at this stage we'll finish it next time. Okay. And this is a lot of that is basic pharmacology, and I think it is better to start with a fresh mind. So I will stop the recording at this stage. It's relatively short, and we'll continue with the next sessions. Thank you very much. Bye bye.